BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNid88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And welcome to BBOR, the home of true crime talk radio and your premier destination for unsolved mysteries, criminal psychology, and exploring the dark side of cyberspace. My name is Ned DeHaan, and I am your host, as well as the creator of AstroPsych 400 here on YouTube, and regular contributor to the Zodiac Killer channel. And a great way to support these shows is just by listening to some more content. But you can also go over to Amazon.com and have a look at the book Killer on a White Horse, written by me, Ned DeHaan. It is a novel, murder mystery, inspired by the Zodiac Manson connection, but it is indeed fictional. However, who doesn't love a good mystery? And there is always the Teespring page. Feel free to check out some of the merchandise. And remember, being weird is not a crime. Let the show begin. Okay, hello everybody. Today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? Hope everyone is well. And just a couple of quick announcements and reminders before we truly begin. The first is that there is now a membership for Black Box Online Radio, and it's available at BuyMeACoffee.com, BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNid88. That's the website that I've used to have donations and contributions for the show for about a year now. But the membership is going to allow people to access bonus features and bonus content. And I'm going to update the page soon because there is another feature that I would like to add to the membership, and that is that at least once a month I'm hoping to do a private YouTube video podcast that is going to talk about user-requested topics. Any subject under the sun or in the darkness, but I'm really hoping that people will look beyond some of the true crime stories that are covered on the channel, such as the Zodiac and Jack the Ripper, because you can already just ask me about those. You can ask those kinds of questions in the comments section here, and I try to respond to your requests and try to incorporate YouTube user questions into the episodes. So I'm really hoping that for something like a private podcast that is only geared toward members, things will get a little bit more personal. People could discuss some types of subjects that are very important to them, but they might not feel comfortable sharing in front of an audience, no matter how big or small. So that's what I'm hoping to do with the BBOR membership, in addition to the other features that have been listed on BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNid88. After doing the Ripper Wednesday segment for several months, I've noticed some things, and that is that I think you guys in the comments section are way more curious about the suspects as opposed to some of the possible Ripper crimes. When I do an episode that's centered on one of the victims that may have possibly have been attributed to Jack the Ripper, I've noticed that there's a larger impact when there's a video that is done on a suspect. And I'm finally at the point where I absolutely agree as well. There's just something that ignites my own curiosity when I am looking into the suspects, and I really felt that this week when I was going through some material about Jack the Ripper. And yes, this is a regular segment, Ripper Wednesday, coming to you almost every Wednesday, so you can also hit the like button and subscribe, as well as visit some links in the description box. But on the channel, I've talked to you about the Inspector Melville McNaughton, who wrote a memorandum where he talked about some Jack the Ripper suspects whom he thought were credible, and I've done standalone episodes on two of them, and they are Montague John Druitt and Aaron Kosminski. I think Montague John Druitt is a bottom-of-the-barrel suspect, very low on my rating scale, but Aaron Kosminski, I think, is a very favorable Jack the Ripper suspect, and the other one I have not mentioned in an episode before, and his name is Michael Ostrog. But the reason why these three suspects have been identified is because Melville McNaughton was trying to point out that he thought that these three people were more likely the Ripper than an individual named Thomas Cutbush, whom I'm going to be discussing today. And the reason why Thomas Cutbush becomes so heavily mixed into the list of Jack the Ripper suspects is because of an article and then a series of articles that were put out in 1894 by a publication called The Sun, which directly vilified him as being Jack the Ripper, the serial killer who terrorized London in 1888, and 5 women have been murdered by this person. 5 murders have been directly attributed to Jack the Ripper, and whatever happened before or after that is anybody's guess. And of course, I go through the regular Jack the Ripper websites like a lot of you guys, jacktheripper.org, Whitechapel Jack, and Jack the Ripper Tour, whom I speak very favorable of, and of course, Casebook. But for this one, I wanted to also look at some sources from things I haven't covered too much before on the channel, maybe once or twice, and one of them is saucyjackie.wordpress.com, and there's a full write-up on Thomas Cutbush as a Jack the Ripper suspect. Cutbush was born in 1866 in Kennington, and by all accounts he had a privileged childhood. He was first mentioned as being the Jack the Ripper suspect in a series of articles written in 1894 by the Sun newspaper, and these accounts present a compelling argument for Cutbush being the notorious Whitechapel fiend. In these accounts, the journalist states that they have proved that Cutbush was employed in Whitechapel shortly before the murders and was still there at the time of the Ripper scare, and that he once threw a coworker off of a balcony in a fit of rage. They say that he lived an ideal life, wandering around the streets at night, coming home in the morning with muddy clothes. They give an account of a strange encounter in which a young couple was approached by an excited and weird-looking man who told the couple that they were after him, and that they say he was Jack the Ripper, but that he wasn't. He was a medical man. This incident occurred after Cutbush escaped from an infirmary in early 1891. The newspaper talks about his mental state, in which says that he became convinced himself that he had various diseases and maladies, even though he was perfectly healthy. In all likelihood, Cutbush was probably a paranoid hypochondriac, a trait shared by the notorious disorganized serial killer Richard Chase. They say that he suffered from mania and delusions, and they even talk about him studying medical books and drawing lurid and ghastly pictures of women's mutilated bodies. The lengthy series of articles does indeed paint a portrait of an insane man and a violent man who shares certain characteristics consistent with that of a disorganized serial killer. However, the main issue is that there's no hard evidence to support most of what the newspaper claimed. We know that Cutbush did at one time work in the Minories, which was close to the Whitechapel area, but there's no proof he was actually in Whitechapel during the murder spree. There's no doubting that he was an insane and he had violent tendencies, but the crimes for which he was committed to Broadmoor Asylum for were far from the frenzied overkills of the Ripper. These relatively minor attacks are often an argument against the candidacy of Cutbush being Jack the Ripper, who brutally killed and mutilated his victims. Okay, and this is talking about how he went into the asylum years after, and it says that he also escaped from an infirmary in 1891. And even if you get on Thomas Cutbush's Wikipedia page, you'll see that the theory is that the reason why he was having this deteriorating mental state was because he had syphilis and it was affecting his brain and his judgment as well as his temperament. And you have some guy who would have contracted syphilis from a prostitute and then just wanted revenge on women, so he was going after women in vulnerable places, becoming more and more dangerous and more deadly. And I talk about this all the time on Ripper Wednesday. It does indeed appear that Jack the Ripper was escalating in deviant behavior from the murder of Polly Nichols to the murder of Mary Kelly. So, I mean, those points would make sense. However, Thomas Cutbush was confined to asylums, and even it says he escaped from an infirmary in 1891, and there are medical records. And another thing that did surprise me about the Jack the Ripper story is when we look at the suspects, you often find that even back to the 1800s, medical records have been preserved. I mean, they even talked about this in the James Maybrick documentary, The Diary of Jack the Ripper, Jack the Ripper's Diary, and it says that they have documentation that he was in London at the time of the murders because of his medical appointments, and records have been preserved. Now, I mean, we have to accept that a lot of people are telling the truth, and it's not like as simple as all of the records have just been stored electronically and shared on the internet. More or less, we find commentary sources that are citing these records, but the issue is on a different Jack the Ripper website. I think it was jacktheripper.org actually. It talked about how there was no record of him actually having syphilis, and that might have just been a piece of fantasy-filled journalism. I first learned that term when I was doing an episode for Black Box Online Radio called the Atlas Vampire Murder. It was about the murder of Lily Lindström, a woman who died in Stockholm in 1932, and someone said just that the actual story, like based on reports and based on the facts of the case that were gathered at the time, was very different than how it was portrayed by one particular journalist who might have had an incident involving fantasy-filled journalism. Oh, and fantasy-filled journalism definitely would go back well before Stockholm in 1932, going all the way back to I think the dawn of humanity, because some people have overactive imaginations. Other people also have particularly a strong desire to overinflate a story if it's fueling their own excitement. And I purely think that that is about personality traits. And I talk all about personality traits and how to read them in the guide called True Crime Teaches Us to Conquer Toxic People, which is one of the bonus features of the Black Box Online Radio membership. If you sign up for that, you will get a copy of the guide. And, I would be really curious what other people think, what you guys in the comments section think. But let's look at some more basic info about Thomas Cutbush. I mean, as people said, as I think the universal consensus is, he is someone who had mental issues. He is someone who was mentally unstable to a certain extent. I mean, beyond a certain extent, if he is confined to Broadmoor Asylum and spends an enormous amount of time there and ultimately would pass away. But firstly, he was 22 years old at the time of the Whitechapel murders, and I don't necessarily think that Jack the Ripper was 22 years old. I said some very favorable things about Aaron Kosminski as a suspect, and I think that he's somewhat of an exception because I tend to lean more toward the psychological profile that was shared by John Douglas, yes, the FBI profiler John Douglas, and he talked about how he estimated that Jack the Ripper would have been closer to age 30, late 20s, early 30s, whereas somebody like Thomas Cutbush would have been in his early 20s. And I think that it is just more based on how this is someone who was targeting women because of a type of rage that had been brewing for a very long time, and it feels very calculating, whereas I would expect that a younger serial killer would be doing something that was a little bit more brash and brazen as opposed to the sneakiness and stealthiness of Jack the Ripper. And it's true that the Ripper could have almost been caught perhaps multiple times. I mean, he's murdering these women in very public places, and it seems like even though the Ripper was certainly mentally ill himself, he did show a lot of awareness and stealthy features that I think a lot of people do not estimate at the time. But like all of the true crime cases that I talk about here on Black Box Online Radio, I will accept the result, no matter who the suspect is. If there's some breakthrough in the Jack the Ripper mystery, and it turns out, yes, indeed, the Jack the Ripper case has been solved and the Ripper was 22 years old, I would just be like, okay, well, I was wrong. I mean, I thought he would have been older, and it's possible. I mean, I think that's something that would most likely eliminate a suspect would be if he were perhaps maybe 16 years old, or maybe if he was in his 70s, like somebody such as Sir William Gull. So I think that that is not 100% elimination, but I definitely would again put them on the lower end of the suspect ratings. 22 is possible, and let's give it a strong possibility. But we have to remember that that memorandum from Melville McNaughton talks about how there are other suspects who might be better than Thomas Cutbush, and one of them is indeed Aaron Kosminski. I think that Kosminski was looked at much more closely by the law enforcement authorities at the time. Kosminski also was someone who was sent into an asylum. It seems like they were zoning in on him for a reason, whereas somebody like Thomas Cutbush, it seems that he was just a tabloid suspect that was pulled up by the Sun. And the reason why I'm using the word tabloid suspect is I also closely follow the Zodiac Killer mystery, and countless times there is a suspect who is vilified in the court of public opinion. There's a suspect that is vilified by a media publication. I mean, we don't even have to go back to some people who've been mentioned on things like Fox News and TMZ, even going back to the early 2000s when tabloids, I mean real tabloids, were all saying that Bill Menser was the Zodiac Killer. And well, I mean, obviously the case remains unsolved. Just because someone is named by a media publication as being the serial killer and solving the mystery does not mean that it's actually true. And I will share another observation about the case. When it says that Thomas Cutbush committed two other crimes against women and they were minor incidents, what they're talking about is that Thomas Cutbush stabbed two women in the buttocks with knives. I mean, like on different occasions, he took a knife and he stabbed a woman in the buttocks. And this is one of the times where I'll play the card. Serial killers usually tend to get more violent, and you wouldn't expect that someone is going to be less violent when he is in his later years as opposed to his earlier years. And I think that the only real explanations for that would be that maybe if you had a serial killer who went on 20 or 30 years after his prime, and who had a reign of terror that maybe lasted 8 to 12 years, and then a couple decades later he committed an additional attack. But yes, normally someone doesn't start out less vicious than they end up in the world of true crime. And if anybody would like to challenge me on that and provide some examples to the contrary, I would love to read your comments in the section down below. So I've just stated, though, that Jack the Ripper was escalating and with violent tendencies, not de-escalating. But one point that is discussed by Melville McNaughton is that he believes that Jack the Ripper only murdered 5 people. Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Mary Kelly, and Liz Stride and Catherine Eddowes, although I didn't say them in the chronological order. It would be Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Liz Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Kelly was the final victim. And I tend to agree with that, but only because I'm not completely convinced of any of the other crimes. I have said very clearly that I think that there is an 80% chance that the Ripper murdered Martha Tabram in the weeks prior to the more famous Whitechapel crime spree. And one of the inspectors who had his own observations about the Jack the Ripper case was Walter Dew, and I have to apologize in a previous episode for calling him Harold Dew, and I don't know why, but there's some types of wires in my brain that are crossed, and I just want to refer to him as Harold when his name was Walter Dew. And if I misspeak or anything, I'll try to correct myself, but I mean, sometimes people just have slip-ups. And yes, I did say that on a previous Ripper Wednesday. But with Walter Dew, the major point that I find so shocking is he was a member of law enforcement, an investigator and an inspector who thought that Emma Smith was a victim of Jack the Ripper. And Emma Smith was murdered in the spring of 1888, months and months before the Whitechapel, crime spree that took place that is known as the canonical Ripper crime spree. Emma Smith is heavily recognized as being the first Whitechapel murder victim, to be clear, but it is an unconfirmed Jack the Ripper story, and the reasons why are so overwhelming that I am truly shocked that a member of law enforcement would even consider that the Ripper had any involvement with Emma Smith's death. Number one, she lived to tell the story of how multiple people attacked her, that multiple males attacked her, and that they were all much younger than even somebody such as Thomas Cutbush. I mean, we're talking about late teen years and so on. And she was also sexually assaulted with an object. Very, very different types of crimes than what the Ripper committed. So I think that that is just a completely different story. But Walter Dew would have his own place in history because he became the member of law enforcement that was responsible for the arrest of Dr. Crippen, which is what I would like to talk to you about now. So as you see, like many of the other true crime stories that I talk about on BBOR, the inspectors, detectives, and the investigators can be heavily connected to other high-profile true crime stories. And the story of Dr. Crippen becomes famous because it is sometimes regarded as the first time that wireless telegraphic communication was the primary method used to apprehend a a suspect. However, it is also stated, even on the Wikipedia page for Dr. Crippen, that it was one of the first times that the wireless telegraph was used to be the primary method to apprehend a suspect. And sometimes it says it the first, sometimes it says it's just one of many. But I'd like to go to the historypress.co.uk, and it says the notorious case of Dr. Crippen. In 1893, Howley Harvey Crippen married his second wife, Cora Turner, in Jersey City, America. 7 years later, in 1900, they moved to London. He was employed as a representative for Munyon's Remedies, a company making homeopathic remedies, while Cora used the name Belle Elmore, and she had aspirations to be a music hall artist. Unfortunately, Belle had no talent whatsoever. Sometimes you just gotta love British dry humor. But as far as working for the homeopathic remedies company, here's something else that I didn't know before looking into Jack the Ripper, and that is that these types of homeopathic doctors were so incredibly popular, and we see this with other Jack the Ripper suspects. And to be clear, Dr. Crippen is not a Jack the Ripper suspect. There was just an inspector in both of the cases, but you see Jack the Ripper suspects like Francis Tumblety, who was openly named a medical quack on his own Wikipedia page, and it does seem like he was indeed a medical quack. And then you have abusive doctors like Thomas Neal Cream, who were just committing very, very heinous forms of malpractice that involved into intentional homicide. And that's why Thomas Neal Cream is and was a serial killer known as the Lambeth Poisoner, who was hanged at the gallows for his criminal actions. But let's read more about Dr. Crippen. In fact, neither Belle nor Cora was the real name of Mrs. Crippen. She had been born Kunigunde Makmatsi and was the daughter of a Russian-Polish father and a German mother. She was also a most overbearing and dominant character. Her long-suffering husband had supported her ambitions to be the first an opera singer, but when that didn't work out, a singer in the music hall, but she had very little success. All she did manage to get out of her career was a few show business friends and the position of treasurer of the Music Hall Ladies Guild in London. And something else that you also see in the Ripper mystery and the Ripper case and just the interactions that people had in those days is that a lot of people were crossing the ocean, and when they got kicked out of America, when they failed in America, they went back to England, and when they failed in England, they went to America. This happens all the time. Prime examples would be Francis Tumblety and Thomas Neal Cream, the two quack doctors that I had just been talking about. Both of them started out in one other place, and then they were just moved across the ocean to another. And some of them sometimes doing it for legal reasons, other times doing it because they were just well, perhaps somewhat connected to the geographical areas, and other times it was just opportunities to spread their medical quackery. So, in September of 1905, Dr. Crippen and his wife took a lease on 39 Hilldrop Crescent in Holloway. Part of the thinking behind this move was the part that the pair could now have separate bedrooms. Bill had never been a really sexual person, and according to what Crippen would later say, all physical relations between them ceased in 1907. Crippen, meanwhile, had fallen in love, and the object of his desire was Ethel Leneve, a typist who worked for him. At about the same time that Crippen stopped having sex with Belle, he and Ethel became lovers. The situation continued until 1910. Now, I'm just going to get to the point, and I found this rather extensive video on YouTube that was talking a lot about the Dr. Crippen story, and I just liked how they narrated what happened. So Dr. Crippen is with this other woman, Ethel Leneve, and he murders his wife. Yes, he goes on to murder his wife, and he buries her body in the basement of their home. And it's done in a very rough and rudimentary way. It's done in a way that isn't really hiding the body truly. They could, even when someone walked down into the basement, they could see the bricks above his wife's body, and it seemed very apparent that he wasn't truly trying to disguise the situation. What he was doing was trying to just buy some time so that he could get away. And he actually flees to Belgium first with Ethel and Ev, and at this point they're trying to go into hiding because the authorities were onto them, and she is actually dressed as a young boy. They're almost trying to pass off as an older man and a young boy going into Belgium, and then from Belgium into America. But because of the use of the wireless telegraph, then, I mean, Walter Dew was able to alert the authorities in North America, as well as trying to arrive there faster than Dr. Crippen could, but they are apprehended in North America. And I'm going to go back to that article from the historypress.co.uk, which just says Crippen's defense was simple. The body found in the cellar of his home was not Belle's. The body must have been some poor unknown woman and placed there before he and Belle had moved in. It was therefore crucial to the prosecution to prove that the body was Belle's. I mean, what a ridiculous and borderline idiotic defense. I don't know how to say that. It's an idiotic defense. That's a stupid thing to say. Medical tests had shown that the flesh contained traces of hyoscine, a poison, and it was known that Crippen had purchased 5 grains of that substance on January 17th, 2 weeks before Belle had vanished, and it was enough for the jury, who took just under 30 minutes to find Crippen guilty of his wife's murder. On October 25th, Ethel Leneve was put on trial as an accessory to murder and found not guilty. And I'm not even surprised that happened. It seems like all the blame is going on Dr. Crippen. A subsequent appeal on behalf of Crippen was dismissed, and his death sentence was confirmed. On Wednesday, November 23, 1910, 48-year-old Dr. Crippen was hanged at Pentonville by John Ellis and William Willis. Crippen's last request had been for a photograph of Ethel and some of her letters to be buried with him in an unmarked grave. The request was granted. So, Dr. Crippen, I mean, it's his own true crime story that is very loosely connected to the case of Jack the Ripper. And I would also like to talk to you guys about something that relates to several different Jack the Ripper suspects. And I was quite surprised because earlier today, I was watching the movie Memories of a Murder. It's just something that I found on YouTube and that I had downloaded. And it talks about how, I mean, it explores the possibility of someone who has murderers in her family tree, and possibly even serial killers in her family tree. And I always go back to James H. Fallon and The Psychopath Inside when he talked about how that serial killers most likely have a genetic component. It's in their genes. Something in their genes is driving them to kill. And the movie Memories of a Murder, which you can watch on YouTube for free, I downloaded it via YouTube Premium 3 months ago, actually, and just got around to watching it earlier today. And it talks about what that would be like. Because a lot of people believe that certain Ripper suspects are in that category, and one of them is Thomas Cutbush, whom I was discussing at the beginning of the episode. And an explanation that was provided for his mental instability that goes against the theory that he had syphilis is actually that his family had neurological issues and neurological disorders and genetic disorders that were passed down from one person to another over many generations. And at the very least, it appears that Thomas Cutbush was a violent and dangerous criminal. I mean, if he stabbed women multiple times, then yes, he's a violent and dangerous criminal. Another fact that I read about Thomas Cutbush was that he was raised mostly by his mother and his grandmother, and while it says that he lived somewhat of an ideal life, it seems that they were very aloof, they were very bizarre, and they had a lot of odd tendencies that most likely stemmed from some type of neurological issue, or there's some type of neuropsychological issue that is going on in his family tree. I thought that it was quite a coincidence that I was reading about this and watching a movie about that similar subject. And in Memories of a Murder, it explores the possibility that could somebody actually be born and programmed to kill? Is somebody born in just a more dangerous person? And I think the answer to that is absolutely yes. Because I've said this so many times on the channel that serial killers have heightened predatory instincts. I mean, their focus is how to commit these crimes. I mean, they're predators. We use that word all the time when we're talking about people, but it also goes beyond that because it relates a lot back to sociopathy and psychopathy, talking about how when someone is a psychopath, they just have this obsession with manipulating other people. And I think it relates a lot to just the whole concept of someone is set with a set of factors. They are faced with a set of factors like, oh, if I say this and that person says this, then I can say that, and then I will be able to dominate them by saying this. There's no empathy in that. There's no sympathy and there's no regard for the other person's emotions. They are just simply doing certain actions to achieve domination. And somebody like Jack the Ripper, I think, absolutely would be in that category because Jack the Ripper seems all about domination. Now, I said very clearly that I would accept the result of Thomas Cutbush being Jack the Ripper if it did indeed turn out that he was. But instead, I think that he was just someone who was a mentally ill man, someone who grew up as somewhat of a mama's boy and a grandma's boy, maybe even experienced some type of bizarre abuse at the hands of someone in his family tree, although I don't want to say any more than that because I don't want to speculate in an unfair way. But that's my honest take on the subject, and I would love to know what you think about some of the Jack the Ripper suspects that I've talked about in this episode. Definitely Thomas Cutbush, as well as perhaps Francis Tumblety and Aaron Kosminski. You can write anything you want in the comment section down below. And I will also say that I have mentioned the place where Thomas Cutbush ended up before on the channel, Broadmoor Asylum, in a couple different episodes, and one of them was the one that I did on Mahmoud Hussein Matan, the man who was wrongfully convicted of a murder in the 1950s in the United Kingdom, and the person who was a very likely suspect ended up in Broadmoor, and I read a lot about Broadmoor in the book The Psychopath Test by John Bronson, and that is one that I hope that I can get back to at some point. I was listening to the audiobook on YouTube. Some people use the verb reading an audiobook. They are reading an audiobook, but I go back and forth. Anyway, I'd love to know what you think about the Jack the Ripper suspects, and please put your ideas in the comment section down below. Even if you have a comment about Dr. Crippen, I would love to know what you think. And my biggest take on the subject is the guy committed a very sloppy murder, and he didn't even care. He just wanted to get away and go on the run, and he thought he would fool everyone by going to Belgium, and his girlfriend, his mistress, is wearing a silly disguise. Just because somebody is smart does not mean they're smart all the time. And, well, I mean, I don't think we have to leave it at that, because I would like to share some things that I have mentioned about this before on the channel, because I used to watch Forensic Files so frequently, and you would encounter this stuff all the time about doctors and nurses and people who were professionals, yet they commit extremely sloppy crimes. And one thing that I said that I've never heard from anyone else is that sometimes people want to get caught and they don't know it. They're almost self-sabotaging themselves in certain ways because they want to be pulled out of the miserable life that they're in, even if it means that they're going to jail. That's just the end, though. Like, they want to put an end to it, and it's very saddening, but I do think that that's what happens from time to time. Alright, anybody can respond in the comment section down below. You can also write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com. My email address is in the description box, as well as my personal Facebook. And of course, there is always BlackBoxNid88 over on Instagram. And I'll see you guys over there. Until next time.